Hello, and welcome to Three Truths and a Lie, a Mechanics First Mindset. I'm Noah Rosenfield. I'm a game designer, programmer, and the creator of Addagrams, a word puzzle game which won the big indie pitch at Pocket Gamer Connect's Toronto. I was recently invited to give a talk about my game design philosophy on a Mechanics First Mindset, but it wasn't recorded, which is why I'm here today presenting it again, just for you. So, let's get started. We're going to look at some ideas that I'm hoping will give you some new ways of thinking about your designs and how you can stand out in an incredibly competitive and saturated market. And I've brought along a few experts to help. So, to understand what we mean by mechanics first, let's take a quick look at where mechanics fit into the overall structure of a game. As the academic of the group, we'll start with a breakdown from designer and professor Jesse Schell. Jesse says, the four basic elements that comprise every game: story, aesthetics, technology, and mechanics. Story is, well, the story. It's the story your game tells or the story you tell through your game. The aesthetic is the look, sound, and feel of your game. The technology is the tools and materials used to bring your game into existence. And the mechanics are the actions and reactions between the game and the player. Now, Jesse says that none of the elements is more important than the others. They are all essential. No matter what game you design, you will make important decisions about all four elements. Well, thank you, Jesse. However, that's a lie, and we'll prove it in 3 words. Tag. You're it. Boop. Now, tag is pretty interesting. It has no win state, just a goal. Don't be it. And one mechanic. Physical contact transfers itness. The goal isn't even an absolute, since some people enjoy being it in general, and some people enjoy being it temporarily so that they can go tag a specific someone. But there is no story, no aesthetic, and no technology inherent to the game. And most importantly, no decisions ever arose about these things. Even a decision to exclude them is never explicitly made. The application of a single mechanic took us from 0 to 1, and we never even had to think about the other elements. We just started playing. And it's a powerful play experience, one that single-handedly encompasses an entire theme: being chased. Being chased is a theme that carries excitement and terror regardless of when or what it is. Whether you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, a spooky ghost, the actual it, failure, or an unfortunately excerpted tweet. And the fact that there's this lack of a need for story, aesthetic, or technology is what makes this play experience so portable across time, culture, and even species. That isn't to say you can't start adding the other elements to tag, either by accident or on purpose. And why not? Well, because why not is the worst reason imaginable. Our first truth from Satoru Iwata. Why is a good question for focusing your mechanics, because it's a cause and effect question. For any element of your game, ask yourself, why is this thing the way it is? And then subject that answer to the same question again. Why is that the way it is? Once you reach an answer grounded in your game's mechanics, you should have a pretty good understanding of the importance of that thing to your game, which ties into our next truth. When you figure out exactly what is necessary for this game, a world of possibilities will open up. It's another deep truth, and in more ways than one, because it opens possibilities for both the designer and the player. The player's imagination is an easily forgotten and underutilized asset by many designers because it's one that you can't see, touch, or control. But it can add narrative and aesthetic layers to the experience that you could never hope to provide on your own. And if you give it room to flourish and bloom, in the right conditions, it can grow over the gaps in your design, saving you the time, effort, and uncertainty of trying to patch them yourself. It can be difficult to know which gaps it can fill because the player's imagination is a bit subjective. Willingness or ability to make that jump will vary from player to player. So I can't give you a way to discern which elements act like this other than putting the game in front of actual players. But what I can tell you is that if you've already paved over the player's imagination space, it will be impossible to know what they might have done otherwise. And our third truth from Satoru on the ubiquity of complex combinations in modern gaming: unsatisfying. That's what happens when the design is based on the idea of more, more, more. And this feels pretty accurate to me. I would note that the lack of satisfaction is actually felt on both sides of the interaction, designer and player. Your innermost mechanical loops must be solid. If your inner loops are off, every subsequent loop suffers. Problems will continue to arise, but be harder to diagnose as they become hidden from view. Our next set of truths come from Derek Yu, creator of Spelunky, who offers more insight into the designer satisfaction issue that we're just talking about, as well as another perspective on the problems of more. Derek says, limiting the number of new things you have to learn is crucial to finishing your projects. More will always take longer. The majority of ideas don't fail in the market. They fail in materializing. Estimating the amount of time that something will take is already difficult, and the game industry's track record of crunch time and half-finished or canceled releases speaks to that. And if the task you're trying to estimate is something you haven't done before, it goes from difficult to nearly impossible. Yu has plenty to say on completing projects as a skill, and so coming from Derek, someone who prides himself on his ability to finish games, this next one really jumped out at me. Only adding small twists on conventional gameplay was hurting my motivation to keep working on them. It didn't add anything new to the genre. This ties into what Satoru says about satisfaction. It's hard to get excited about the work if you don't think the work is going to excite other people. And it's hard to excite other people with something they've already seen before. If your mechanics don't have anything new to say, by the time you need to talk about story and aesthetic, you may find yourself so bored by the conversation that you decide it's not even worth having. Derek also describes his design process in a way that really resonates with me. The creative mind is like a big pile of jigsaw pieces. Some pieces are already connected, either because they came that way or they somehow found each other. I find the notion of a game's mechanics as a series of connected puzzle pieces to be a pretty accurate analogy, and I would draw attention to the second half, that some pieces are already connected because they came that way. I would invite you to break them apart. If you want to find newness, find the mechanic that everyone else takes for granted as whole. Find the seam and separate it. You'll discover that those two pieces attach to far more things than what they came with. Now, before we hear from our third and final truth sayer, I'll show a little bit of how these ideas contributed to or stemmed from the development of Addagrams. So here are the things you need to know about Addagrams. Players start with 6 letters and create 2 words. Each round, players get 1 new letter and repeat. That's pretty much it. So here you can see we've got numerous possible answers right off the bat. And here we've got a screenshot of the players starting out their second round with an added letter T, our completed second round, again, one of many possible answers, and a jump to our 9th and final round, where the player has earned all 8 tiles over the course of the game and is now trying to create 2 7-letter words. That progression of create 2 words, add a letter, repeat, are the mechanics we'll be looking at. So how did we get here? Well, anagramming as a skill feels like to me that it should primarily be measured by your ability to see possibilities and an emphasis on using all of the provided letters. I felt that many word games utilizing anagramming as a key mechanic were combined with other rules that actually worked against that skill, sometimes fairly arbitrarily. Most anagram-based games stem from one idea. Here's a handful of letters. Find every possible word. And that's it. That's the whole game. It's the entirety of Text Twist, and they add a timer. It's the entirety of Spelling Bee, minus any words that don't use the special letter. And it's the entirety of Wordscapes, except Wordscape stops you after you've found the 10 answers that they've arranged into this pseudo crossword. So, this left me with a few basic constraints. Firstly, don't do this. Beyond that, avoid the content treadmill for puzzle generation. Highlight anagramming as a skill. And lastly, don't limit the player. Now, I can't really remember where the idea of add a letter, make a new word came from, but I've always had an interest in wordplay and the way that language can transform, like when a light up sign changes meaning because of missing letters. And I knew that the mechanic of add a letter, make a word was fun and interesting. I knew that the puzzle could be conveyed and played with minimal information. All the player needed was the current set of letters and a way to answer. We built the first prototype with only text prompts. I was texting friends a starting set of letters, and then each new letter after they sent me their answer. So I was aware that we had no spatial constraints, no set board within which to play. That let me focus on finding a goal state from a point of player satisfaction instead of the point of, when you finish the puzzle, it should look like this. And that let me build a UI focused on matching and extending the player's natural thought processes instead of guiding them towards some final static layout. And we received a number of compliments on the intuitiveness of the game board within Addagrams, so I think it worked really well with us. And with anagramming as the primary skill and no other demands like board strategy, players from any other word game could easily make the transition without learning anything new, and improve a skill which would then translate back to the other games that they like to play. For our final set of truths, we go to a namesake of original play experiences, Will Wright, creator of SimCity and The Sims. Will says, I don't start by thinking, what's the game gonna be, or what's the game gonna be like? I look at the components. How would I really like to manipulate it, play with it, or create it? As described, this was very much the way Addagrams started out, by looking at the mechanic of new letter, make a word, repeat, and how that might play out with maximum creative freedom for the player. This next quote from Will you may have already heard, either from him or somewhere else, but it's as true now as it ever was, and so bears repeating. A lot of times you've got too much stuff, too much noise from the player's point of view. One of my favorite quotes about Japanese gardening is that your garden is not complete until there's nothing else that you can remove. Now, we tried to keep our focus pretty narrow from the outset with Addagrams, but one thing we wanted to explore was competitive play. We expected this to need a UI to present all of the in-progress games, incoming challenges from other players, things like that. We spent a decent amount of time trying to make that whole flow very user-friendly, enough that it could be tested. Then we discovered players were only ever playing one puzzle at a time, finishing it, and then going to the next one. So we were able to strip out a lot of unneeded stuff and focus only on the information that we needed to present. And we've got one final reason for our mechanics first approach. They are the most complex element. For most people, if you give them pen and paper, they could write a story. And if you gave them a camera, they could film a movie. But if you give them a computer and say, make me a game, they won't even know where to begin. Their best option would probably be a game to see who could throw it further. And so what I would say here is that if you have a story or an aesthetic or a technology you want to use, but you don't have any mechanics, it's worth considering whether or not what you need or want to make is a game at all. Perhaps you have the beginnings of a book or a film or a tool, something which would be better served by another medium and free from the complexities of making a game. And Will has a thing or two to say about this, but only one truth left from him, so here it is. I see a lot of game designers that are really aspiring to be storytellers, and I've always thought that the coolest stories are always coming from the players. You want the player to create their own story by what they do in the game. Now, mechanics can lead you to a story. They can lead you to an aesthetic, and they can lead you to a technology, but only if you let them lead. This approach isn't meant to demean the importance of story, aesthetic, or technology. Any of these elements can make the difference between your game existing or not, or getting funded or not, or finding success or not. Even the best mechanics are meaningless if nobody will play the game. But hopefully, we presented some ideas that, at worst, got you thinking, and at best, got you thinking differently. I'd like to give a huge thanks to the experts who have gifted their ideas and insights to the world of game design, and an even bigger thanks to all of the players without whom none of this would matter. Once again, I'm Noah Rosenfield. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And if you're interested in Addagrams, you can check out the game at addagrams.com. Thank you for joining.